Hi, I'm faculty editor Virginia Shank, and I'm here today with the author Wayne Rapp, and we're going to be chatting about his story After the Falls. So, one thing that interested me about the story is this idea of a character who's kind of at this moment in his life of possible change, right? And then all of that falls by the wayside. I'm going to try not to spoil it in case anyone hasn't read the story. You should read the story. But I'm curious about how this story began. Was there a seed that got you started? Was there something about the character or an event that made you think about this scenario?
Well, my background, my actual job, most of us writers do this in our spare time, or not spare time, we make time to do it. But I worked for a number of years in corporate situation in motion pictures and television. So I have a background in that I thought I could exploit for some of the stories that I've written. And I think probably about 3 of the stories that have been published, including this one, have a background or exist in the field of motion pictures or television. In this particular case, the protagonist is what's referred to in the business as voice talent, or he's a narrator, makes most of his money off camera doing voiceover, but has this real dream about being a corporate spokesman. And he has a chance to go to excuse me, has a chance to go to Starbucks for an interview. And he's hoping that it's to do some training videos, but he's hoping that it may lead to something bigger and better than that. So I started with the idea of the location, because I have been to Starbucks headquarters. I did a video project in conjunction with them. And I was kind of taken by the fact that you could walk in the front door and there was a big coffee stand there. And it made sense, but I hadn't seen that in corporate life before. And so our narrator gets in line, and while he's in line, he spots somebody 3 or 4 people ahead of him that looks really vaguely familiar from the rear. And as the guy turns, he can see a distinctive mark that looks just like a man that he knew. And he is anxious to catch up with him, but the guy's paid for his coffee and gotten on an elevator before he can get away. And the thing that bothers him about it is the guy he knew that this guy resembles is dead. And he knows that for a fact because he was a pallbearer at his funeral. So this is the sequence that starts everything off. And the guy keeps showing up in the man's life. He sees him when when he lands in Cincinnati. He sees him in a taxi driving away. He shows up in his narration booth while he's in the middle of doing some voiceover work. And so the guy is just ever present in his life, and he can't figure out what's going to happen. But and I won't give away the ending of it, but this guy, Henry Smith, just really dominates the character, and it helps reveal a lot about his past as he starts thinking about his relationship with the man. His past starts coming out. So it's something that just dominates the story, and I'm not sure exactly where it came from. I know that I felt like I knew the setting very well. I put the character in the setting, and all of a sudden I thought of why not have him see somebody that from his past life that he knows is dead? And that's what prompted the story.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm interested in the protagonist, Tom, because he seems hardworking. He seems to take his work seriously, but he's not, I think about what my students look for in characters, and I hear the word relatable, or they kind of want to read about people that they admire, these very heroic people, but
Sure.
character is not that. He's not necessarily a super he's not a terrible guy, he's not a villain, but he's not um he doesn't seem deeply good, or like he's going through this redemption story. Do you find it difficult to write characters like that, or do you think it's normal to write characters like that? Is that a choice you made, or did it just kind of happen?
I think it's normal. I would have to say I may identify, a lot with the man's character. His wife points it out to him before he leaves to return to this big job he's got in his Starbucks. But he thinks that he's led a more heroic and a better life than he actually has, and she's not letting him get away with it. And I think I've seen that in in other characters. I've probably seen it in myself with being someone who, when I was doing a lot of corporate work, I traveled a lot, and I was away from the family, and it got to be, well, I'm doing this for this big purpose, but in reality, I knew I was doing it for myself. So I think that's where I came into it.
Thank you. One of the questions I've been asking all of our writers is about your actual writing process. Because we're a college-based journal, we work a lot with students, and they're always kind of curious, what is the work of the writing like? What's your drafting process, your editing process like?
The writing process I know is different for different people. I shared an office once in corporate life with three other writers, and we all had our different approaches. One of the guys I know, I was always amazed. He would get an assignment, he'd come back and sit down, and right away, this goes back to typewriter days. Right away, the typewriter was singing. He would type and type and type and type, and I was one who always liked to work it out in my head first, and I still do that. And I think a good deal of my writing is done in my head before I actually start putting it down on paper. But this guy would, and I'm not saying I was a better writer or he was a better writer, but he would usually do multiple drafts, and I would pretty much on my second draft be cleaning up what I had started with, because I think I had worked most of it out in my head, where he'd worked most of his out on the typewriter.
Thank you. I think you're right that, it's different for every person. And it's been interesting hearing people's responses across the writers. I think we're kind of evenly split between people who really work it out on the page and people who really do a lot of thinking and then fewer drafts. But that thinking is still part of the writing work. Is there anything that gets you going thinking about stories? Is there something, now that you're not in the corporate world getting assignments, that you kind of turn to for inspiration, or that gets you started?
Um, nothing deliberate. It just seems like from time to time, ideas pop into my head, and I start thinking about them and end up deciding I want to flesh something out, or uh, carry it out further. But nothing. I know some writers use prompts and things to get going, but I don't do that.
Well, thank you. Do you have anything else you want to tell us? Any advice for writers, or? projects you want to tell us about?
One thing I'm really think about, and this story comes into play with that, the after the falls story that you have. It said it was a story I really believed in. I couldn't I couldn't believe that I wasn't getting the response from publishers that I thought it should get. And I looked before the interview. I went back and looked at my records, and I'm an old guy. My first published short story was 30 years ago, 1991. And since that time, I've written quite a few, and some I really think were very good, and some I thought were not so good, but I got through them and I sent them out anyway. And I was surprised at those that might be published that I thought weren't as good, and then I'd have better stories. Like I felt this After the Falls was a better story, and for some reason it just didn't seem to catch. And I was so pleased to hear from the ear and the words. We thought it was a beautiful story, and I thought, yeah, so so do I, and I'm glad somebody else thought that. But so my advice to writers would be just believe in your story and keep sending it out. You've got to be willing to put the work into, if you want to be published. Now, some people want to be writers for their own sake, for their own enjoyment. But if you want to be published, you really have to work at sending it out. And it's so easy to do now compared to when I started, when everything was typewritten, and you had to, go to the post office and mail stuff and wait and get a return. And it's easy to do now. And I'd say keep working and keep sending your stuff out.